My name is John Lobell. I teach architecture at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. This is a lecture on the Chicago School for my Frank Lloyd Wright course given in the spring of 2015. So you recall from last week the changing world that I described that Wright lived through. And he was born in a small farming town, grew up on a small farm, and that's how most people lived in the United States and in the world in the 1860s. But the world was rapidly industrializing, and that trend, that industrialization, was something that Wright lived through. Actually, it isn't something, that was there when he got there, but actually lived through it taking place. Now, more specifically, architecturally, the main thing that happens in the late 19th century is the decline of decorated construction and the rise of integrated architecture. Does anybody know the colloquial term for these two things? Robert Venturi called them the duck and the decorated shed. In the decorated shed, you make a serviceable building, and then you put the aesthetic on it like a suit of clothes. So the aesthetic is not in the bones and muscles of the architecture. It's in a suit of clothes which you can change. And that suit of clothes could be a bunch of columns, so it's a courthouse. The 42nd Street Library is a steel building. They just stick those columns on so that you know it's important. You're not holding anything up. Decorated shed of duck architecture is modern architecture, where the aesthetic comes from an honest expression of what's actually there. The form of the building expresses its nature, as opposed to something you stick on. So Corbusier Chandigarh is not something stuck on, it's the architecture. So we're going to see a decline in this and a rise in this in the 19th century. A decline of decorated shed, a rise of duck. So that's Venturi's terms, and we still occasionally use them. So, the decorated shed or decorated construction, the aesthetic is applied to the building like a suit of clothes and may have little relationship to the structure and materials of the building. And that aesthetic is usually derived from historical styles. In integrated architecture, or duck architecture, or modern architecture, all the same thing, the aesthetic is a result of an honest expression of the spaces, structure, and materials of the building. So we're going to see a movement from this to this, and related to that, a rise of abstraction. So instead of making a Corinthian column, you might make a cylindrical shape. And the ending of eclecticism being various historical styles. Oh, let's make this Gothic. Let's make it Greek. Let's make it Roman. So we're going to stop doing that. So this is what's going on architecturally in the 19th century. So let's look at several styles. I'm going to start with the Shingle Style. And Shingle Style begins actually in England, what's called the Queen Anne style. And here we are, 1873. Americans are going to start looking at this. And instead of looking at classical architecture, this architect's looking at medieval architecture. And we see the medieval half timbering, so the medieval chimneys. But more key to that is, look at how irregular, asymmetrical, the disposition of the spaces is based on their function. We have, I don't know, maybe a library reading room here. So it bulges out for the light. These spaces are responding to their needs. We've got something going up here, a dormer pops up. Wherever we have chimneys, these chimney clusters pop up. They're not some regular layout that we then stuff the building into, but we let the building hang out, bulge out, do its thing. So here we are, the Washerman House by H.H. Richardson, Henry Hobson Richardson. So he's one of the important architects when Frank Lloyd Wright is young. In Newport, Rhode Island, he does this one an early Shingle Style house in America, and we see the asymmetry, the chimneys popping up, the dormers popping up, the half timbering, very much responding to its functions and turning against a classical symmetry for a more responsive asymmetry. It sort of has medieval feel to it. There's this house today with some additions. One of the best examples is the Isaac Bell House by McKinmead and White. Now, McKinmead and White become associated with the Beaux-Arts style. They did Penn Station, but this is early in their careers, and they're working in this, again, this shingle style. So first of all, the name Shingle Style comes from the use of shingles, not only on the roof, but on the facades. We see the asymmetry, things bulging out wherever they're needed. We see a notion of skin. Look at the handling of this right here. It's as though this were a sheet of rubber pulled around a frame. So a taut, skin-like quality. These porches wrapping around, again, as they're needed. These would tend to be summer homes in Newport, Rhode Island. Here it is today. And you can see, again, the asymmetry. Here's a cluster back here for the kitchens and pantries. Here we are in a reading room that bulges out. Also, something that's going to come up in Frank Lloyd Wright. I have to telephone Carbonite and have them tell me how to uninstall this thing. So the layout of these rooms are functional as opposed to being put into a preconceived symmetry. And we have large openings, so one room can flow into another. And this is going to be enter into Frank Lloyd Wright's open plan, be a key in modern architecture. This is one of the most famous, the Low House by McKinmead and White, and has everything under a large encompassing roof. Now, this is an architect, Bruce Price, did a series of houses in Tuxedo Park, New York, and let's see which is which. This is the William Kent House, and this is the Chandler House. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's own house for himself. Looked at that last week. So, steep slope roof, Palladian motif, double dormers. These taking it right from these shingle style houses. So Wright sort of begins within this shingle style. Now, there's historians like to trace influences. Oh, you see this one influenced this one, and then that influenced that, the next one, and architects don't like to hear that. They like to think that they're original. So one of the major historians of the architectural historians in the second half of the 20th century, Vincent Scully, wrote a key book on Frank Lloyd Wright and wrote key books on modern architecture. And he was at Yale. He's still there in his 90s, emeritus. And when Wright visited Yale, Scully said to Frank Lloyd Wright, "What about the influence of the shingle style on your early work?" And Wright said, "Son, architecture began when I started putting those houses out on the prairie." So he's not going to acknowledge any influences. But, you know, as historians, we like to put that stuff together. And that then moves into the Ward Willett House, Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie style. We see it's asymmetrical. It's spread out into the landscape. There are Japanese influences here, medieval influences, but definitely no classical influences. So I'm going to follow that thread next week when we look at Wright's early houses. Just to sort of follow through on this, this is the Low House, Bristol, Rhode Island, by McKim of McKim, Mead and White. And here we are, 80 years later, Robert Venturi's house for his mother, the Madame Venturi house, and it's like coming right from there. So we see that stuff is still has its influences up until recently. So that's the shingle style. And the shingle style allows an informal asymmetry, a response to function, a skin-like quality to the exterior surfaces, and becomes precedents for some of what Wright and other modern architects are going to be doing. Next figure we're going to look at is Henry Hobson Richardson. Unfortunately died young, kidney disease. Very powerful architect, a really strong presence. And his first major building is Trinity Church in Boston, right across from the Boston Public Library in Copley Square. And this is very slavishly historical. You can go to France and find the church that this comes from, and parts of it look just like it. But he's going to evolve into sort of abstracting this. So here is Crane Memorial Library by Richardson, and now we're much more, we have a rectangular quality, we're much more geometric. So we're moving toward abstraction. These details are less historical and more abstract. So these windows are like a giant square. This tower is like a cylinder. This dormer is a triangle. This entrance is a half circle. These windows are a rectangle. So we're moving away from these forms being very historical to them being geometric abstractions. Despite the heaviness of the building, there's sort of a skin-like quality. Can't see it here, but a very crisp corner. And then, again, it's like this roof is rubber, and we've slid it with a razor to get these eyelet windows. Come in, we've got an entrance. children's reading room, main library space, and then cubby holes with the shelves, and then circulation. So very clear distinction of the functions, and each of them with their own form. This form, this form, this form, and this form. A very influential building by Richardson is the Marshall Field Warehouse, no longer with us, so we don't have color photos of it. And we see a key idea developing here, and that is we've got a tall building. So hard to say exactly, but maybe it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stories, something like that. And he's using a Renaissance palazzo form, which has a rusticated base, a main story, and an attic story. And he slips an extra one in there, and these are then actually 3 stories. So he's getting his 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stories into a sort of exaggerated 3-part form. Well, let's say you got away with it. What if it were 14 stories? How would you handle that? Ain't gonna work. Before we take that, see what happened with that, just a quick thought about Richardson. This is a building by his at Harvard. First thing we see is these buildings are, when you clean them up, become kind of colorful. So they were either dirty or in original, brand new, but black and white photographs. But now that we're respecting our architecture and cleaning it up, oh my God, there's this red and white checkerboard pattern here. And then we go down to the basement, and where do we see these? Where have you seen something like that? Outside the coffee shop upstairs, we've got the exact same arches in Higgins South. So we are a Richardsonian Romanesque revival building, not by Richardson, but in that style. Okay, now we get to the Chicago school. And Chicago is important for a series of reasons. Architecturally, by being in the middle of the country, or then the middle of the country, it's away from the East Coast, it's away from Europe. So New York is, at least compared to Chicago, close to Europe. And so we have these European influences like Beaux-Arts. Chicago is in the heartland, away from all that, and they feel they are able to develop a unique, original, and modern American architecture. Next thing is it's a wealthy city in the center of commerce, industry, shipping. It's at on Lake Michigan, so we've got all of the industries, the ore, mining, the harvesting of grains, all can be shipped in the Great Lakes by barge and then shipped up and down the Mississippi. So it's really a connecting point for half of the American continent. Next thing is that 1871, the whole downtown burned down, Great Chicago Fire. Now, American cities, 1906 is the Great Fire of San Francisco from an earthquake. These cities were being built very rapidly. They had developed a technique to do that called balloon framing. So 2x4s, wood sheathing on the outside, sheathing on the inside, and you could throw up a building in a day. You could frame out a building in a day. And unskilled labor could do it. So these buildings get built but they are tinder boxes. They are perfect for spreading fires. These Great Fire never happened in New York because New York got built out earlier when it was still masonry, before they had developed this wood framing. And you could have a tenement fire, but it wouldn't spread to the next building because it'd be 8 inches of brick between the two buildings, keep the fire from spreading. Might spread over the roof, but it wouldn't burn down the whole downtown, which is what happened in Chicago. Now, this happened just at a time when there was an explosion of commerce. Railroads are becoming more extensive. Shipping, we're getting a Bessemer process to get steel, for steel framing. So now there's a clear downtown to put up a new generation of buildings. So it clears out and makes possible these new buildings. Louis Sullivan is a key Chicago school architect. We'll talk about him in a minute. Talks about this period in his autobiography. And he says, then presto, as it were, came a magic change. The city had become a center of a giant radiating system of railroads. The lake traffic changed from sail to steam. The population had grown to 500,000 in 1880 and reached 1 million in 1890, and this from a pitiful 4,000 in 1836. So explosive exponential population growth. Thus, Chicago grew and flourished by virtue of pressure from without, pressure of forests, fields, and plain, the mines of copper, iron, and coal, and the human pressure of those who crowded in on it from all sides seeking fortune. Now, at the same time, there's this new technology coming. He talks about the Monadnock Building, we'll see in a minute, which had been masonry, but then it becomes possible to build in steel. It's the Bessemer process of making mild steel had been for some time in operation in the Pennsylvania mills, but the output had been limited to steel rails for the railroads. Structural shapes were still rolled out of iron. Bessemer process itself was revolutionary. So now we've got this new technology, the steel frame, and then the anyway, the development of the steam, the elevators, etc. So all of these electricity, all these technologies are coming together to make possible these high-rise buildings. So of course the steel for the frames, but then all the ancillary technologies, and then the pressure in this tiny area. Everybody wants to be there because it's a center of commerce, and just like in Manhattan, we get this pressure for these high-rise buildings. Now, we always start our story with the Monadnock Building as an example of what not to do. So, Monadnock Building, every time I talk about this, I have to count it. It's 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15, 14, 16 stories tall, all masonry, no steel frame. So when you get down to ground floor, these walls are really thick because they've got to carry all the weight of this, so thick that it actually spreads out to carry the weight as it comes down. Well, this is all lost rental space, these thick walls. And it's just not a great way to build when you go that tall. So from there, we developed the steel frame. First frame buildings were iron, but very quickly moved to steel. And what are the parts of that? Well, we've got our main columns, encased in fireproofing. supporting a girder. What's the difference between a girder and a beam?
Beams are girders.
Correct. A girder is a big beam that carries other beams. So we got our girders, we got our beams. These are all I-beams. What would we use today? Wide flange. So a wide flange is an I-beam where this part is bigger. So we use a slight variation on the shape. Then we fill in. Now today we would put maybe corrugated metal on here and then pour concrete, but in those days they put structural tile arch jammed between these beams. So it's a flat arch wedged in. Then we lay down our conduits, gas, today electricity. Then we pour concrete, and then we put wood on top of that. Today we would put what? Carpet. Or tile or carpet. Now, this doesn't look like our beams today. This is called a composite. So today, whatever size we need this column to be, we can roll that. We can roll huge members. They couldn't do that. They were limited to this big. So here are 1, 2, 4 I-beams bolted together, and then plates riveted actually on there. Where have you seen this? What does this look like? You've all seen it.
The subway tunnels?
Correct. You see these in the subways. And today, again, if we were building that same subway, those would be just very big wide flanges. But you can see this exact configuration in the subways. You've just built this up to make it big enough for what you need structurally. But if you go around the city and see buildings under construction, this is what you'll see to this day. This is a steel frame construction. Here they are going up. And again, we see this all around the city today. Apartment buildings are typically done in poured place concrete. Office buildings are done in steel. So this is the Light-Tier building, or Sears building, by William LeBaron Jenney, who invented the skyscraper. He's the one who put all this together. And we've got, including the aesthetic, we express the vertical of the columns, the horizontal of the floors, infill is glass. There's your skyscraper. Now, here's his framing diagram, and this is elevator, elevator, stair. He doesn't have a clean, coherent core. Today, we'd want to put that in the middle and make a core that's kind of compact. That hasn't been worked out yet. Here it is today. Chicago is very proud of this building, and it is in pristine shape. This is the Reliance building, very tall, thin example. They would bulge out what's called a Chicago window, these bays bulging out. Because there's going to be another skyscraper right across the street, so these bays allow you to look up and down the street. You get that view out from the side. So here we are coming in close. So Chicago window is a large piece of fixed glass, and then an operable window, just like an old-fashioned sliding up and down on either side. Here's one of these operable windows. And then a large piece of fixed glass. Here it is totally restored in beautiful shape. Again, we're now getting proud of our architecture. Anybody know what this is used for today? It was an office building. Can't make these into office buildings anymore because people want bigger floor spaces. So it's a boutique hotel. One of Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings, I showed you last week, the Price Tower, a boutique hotel, PSFS in Philadelphia, one of the first modern aesthetic skyscrapers, boutique hotel. This is one of the key architects of the Chicago school, Daniel Burnham, who's also the one who was overall in charge of that 1893 Chicago World's Fair. And here he's doing a building in New York that's very beloved, the Flatiron Building. Now, just to deviate from Chicago for a minute, of course we're talking about Chicago because that's where Wright begins his career. The architect we're about to see in a moment, the most important Chicago school architect, is Louis Sullivan. Sullivan, for a brief time, worked for Frank Furness. And then a recession came. They had business cycles in those days, just like today. Furness ran out of work, and Sullivan took off and ended up in Chicago. Sullivan had been at the École des Beaux-Arts, but we'll get to him in a minute. So Frank Furness is a really powerful and very interesting architect. There's humorous games that he plays. And the buildings all over Philadelphia, most of them are gone, but one of the most important is now well preserved. The Fischer Fine Arts Building. It's a part of the Department of Architecture and Fine Arts at the University of Pennsylvania, across from the main architecture building. Louis Kahn's studio is right up here. When I was a student, this building was black. You had people burn coal until the 1960s. And so you had 100 years of the city burning coal, everybody. That's how you heated your house. You go up high up and look out, every chimney had black smoke coming out of it throughout the entire city in the Northeast. And so finally, I don't know the year, but in the 80s, the University of Pennsylvania totally restored the building. And they cleaned it and they said, oh my God, it's orange. We thought it might be red, but we would have thought it was going to be orange. So it's a library. We have this little pavilion for the entrance. Come into this stairwell, big main stair, which is this tower. Come into the main reading room of the library, little alcoves, and the main stacks. There have been several versions of these over the decades. So this is what it looked like when I was a student. Now, and it just all these little games here, like if we look at these crenellations here and here, these are, it's like a continuous cornice, and then he pulls every other one down to give you this effect. We know this is a stair because these two windows are on a diagonal. And then there's just all these little, like this window is just out of scale, it's way too big. So it's just playing all these little games. So this is, the entrance is right here. We come in and go through these doors. We're in the main reading room. These are stairs up to the upper spaces. Where have you seen this stairwell? It's the main stair in Higgins Hall South, exact same stair. Same little curlicue, almost the exact same stair, decorations. This is the main reading hall. Okay, so Sullivan worked for Furness and then goes off to Chicago on his own, well, with a partner, Dagmar Adler, a German engineer. So Sullivan studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, only spent a year there, and then came to Chicago, did some small buildings, and then the two of them, again, Sullivan and his engineer partner, got the commission for the major building of the day, the Chicago Auditorium. It's a huge complex. It has a huge opera house in it, office spaces, hotel spaces, and now we're going to start making the connections. Sullivan's office was in this tower. Frank Lloyd Wright's office was right here in the corner. So Wright became chief draftsman for Sullivan. Now, look at how he's handling this facade. We've got our lower rusticated part. We then have our middle part, 1, 2, 3, 4 stories. We then have this part and this part. He's taken this facade directly from Richardson's Marshall Field Warehouse. It's even taller and therefore even less successful. It's like, we're not convinced that's 3 parts. It's just a mess. And he admitted that. But it then prompted him, oh, here's an interior. Unfortunately, there are no color pictures of the interiors, but the spectacular painted ornament. It prompted him to do this building. Frank Lloyd Wright was the chief draftsman on this building. So this is the Wainwright building. It's a Chicago school building. It happens to be in St. Louis. So it's all part of the same Midwest. These offices he did work in St. Louis, Buffalo, Chicago, the whole area. And what he's done here is, I'm going to give it to you the wrong way and then the right way. There are 3 parts to this facade: base, shaft, and cornice. Now, what's the trick that makes this, solves the problem of the tall building? This can be as many stories as you want. Throw in another 5 stories, it still works. He's not pretending he's fitting it into a Renaissance palazzo. So this gives him the ability to make this thing any height. So it's, in a way, he says he solved the problem of the tall building. Now, here's the right way. There's actually not 3, but 5 parts to Louis Sullivan Tower. And there are a bunch of these. There's several of them. One of them right here in Manhattan, the Bayard building. Number 1 is the basement. It's got mechanical equipment in it. Number 2, the first floor, with entrance and public commercial spaces like bank or store. Number 3, second floor for semi-public spaces. So professionals who get visited, like a dentist or a doctor, would be on the second floor. Number 4 are indefinite number of identical loft spaces for our offices. And here we could count them: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 7, but there could be 14. There could be 20. Number 5, the roof space with more mechanical equipment, such as the machines for the elevators. So those are the 5 parts of Louis Sullivan skyscraper, and simplified, you can say 3 parts. So here, you see he's gone from Richardson to his own building to this solution. And then these spandrels are, Sullivan always uses ornament. We'll get to that in a minute. Now, we look at this building, we come around it, and this facade is here, 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 and here. And this is just plain red brick. Well, I've never found any pictures of that. The reason this is U-shape is that they got electric light, but they don't have big fluorescent fixtures. And they don't have air conditioning. So everybody's got to be near a window. Obviously, these offices are higher rent and these offices are lower rent, because these guys are looking into a light shaft. These guys get the view. This is what this looks like today. It's been painted white and there's a skylight. It's enclosed. But originally it's the back with the skylight. Now, and this is plain red brick. So what Sullivan has done is he said, here's my building. I've now applied the aesthetic like a suit of clothes, but nobody sees the back. So, you know, in the 1950s, TV Guy had an article about a news commentator who always wore like a tuxedo, and he was always in his underwear, in his shorts, because he was sitting at a desk. You don't see that. You know, so he had this tuxedo jacket, and we read the news. But, you know, the camera didn't see under the desk. So you could just as easily take this suit of clothes off and put on a different one. Wright objected. He said, the aesthetic should grow from the inside out. So that, yes, my back is different from my front because the muscles are working differently, but both of them are a rib cage enclosing lungs overlaid with muscles. So that the aesthetic of your front and back should be in the same family and should grow from the inside to the outside, not be hung on like a suit of clothes. Okay, we can all go home. That's the whole course. That the aesthetic derives from, organically from, what the building is, how it's used, how it works, how it's constructed, not hung on like a suit of clothes that could be changed. So that's what Wright's going to do different from Sullivan, although we'll see the similarity in a minute. So here's the Bayard Building. I'm not sure, I think maybe it's Elizabeth Street, but right here in Manhattan, a block off of Houston. Then later, Carson Perry Scott starts to look very modern, but he keeps his ornament. So, in the middle of all this, these architects pioneering modernism comes along this Chicago World's Fair and, you know, torpedoes the whole thing. And several million people came to the fair, and they all went home. And, well, we had dirty, dark, dingy, red brick, sooted with black smoke cities. And here everything was white and clean and looked like marble. And they said, why don't our cities look like that? And they went home and built them. So in New York, the old NYU Uptown campus now, Bronx Community College, Museum of the City of New York, 42nd Street Library, Low Library at Columbia University, Metropolitan Museum, Grand Central Station, the old Penn Station, Brooklyn Museum, Brooklyn Grand Army Plaza, the Washington Square Arch, all built within 10 years of this, in this style. And these guys were blown out of the water, these modern architects. It's like nobody wanted this stuff. 50 years later, they were back on track, but they got sidelined by this. Sullivan, career declined. Later in his career, he did a series of banks throughout the Midwest. Very interesting. But here we are, 30 years after that Chicago World's Fair, and the great building of the time is being built. This is the Tribune Tower. So the Chicago Tribune was a great newspaper. Newspapers were, a major newspaper in those days would be like Google, Yahoo, and NBC TV, all wrapped up in one. Because that's all there was newspapers. And so they were mighty cultural institutions. And Chicago Tribune is building its headquarters. They have a famous competition.
So is John Meade Howells, is he from McKinley and White?
Nope. But what building did he do that's nearby? Memorial Hall at Pratt Institute. And anybody know what Hood did? He was one of the key architects in Rockefeller Center. So, but let's just try something here. So they had a competition. Everybody entered. Walter Gropius entered. Lots of major architects of the day entered the competition. So this is Adolf Loos, who wrote the essay, Ornament is a Crime. He does a giant Doric column. This is this is the winner. Let's see. This is Walter Gropius, founder of the Bauhaus. It's quite a modern building. Anyway, we have in the library, they published a book of all the entries. Again, that's the winner. Anyway, lots of really interesting, weird stuff. And the one that won has flying buttresses. It's Gothic revival. They don't do a thing. They're just decorative. But, oh, tall, Gothic. The Gothics made towers. We should use Gothic. How about nothing? How about letting the structure express itself? Oh, no, that's too dull. So we're back to this. But then, just a few years later, by the 1930s, we're making modern skyscrapers. Got to clean some stuff out. So, Sullivan wrote 3 books. The last one is A System of Architectural Ornament. And he used ornament, but he considered it organic. Like, this is a square. So how do you arrive at this? Well, we start with the square. What's the first thing about a square? It's perimeter. What's the next thing? It's ordinates. What's the next thing? It's diagonals. So, sort of an ornament growing by the square expressing the nature of its squareness. Now we could question that. We'll just make a plain square. But he's still into ornament, and this is what his ornament looks like. But also in that book, he ends with this. We're going to spend some time on this throughout the course. He has a drawing of a cutoff, a seed split open, and then the germ here. And he says, the germ is the real thing, the seat of identity. Within its delicate mechanism lies the will to power, the function, which is to seek and eventually to find its full expression in form. So we're going to spend a big chunk of the course unpacking this, because this is exactly Frank Lloyd Wright's approach to architecture. But what he's saying here is that, in this germ, there's an inner will. So when I said, you know, what's inside expressing itself. Not just functionally, okay, they're ribs. But what does a school, to use Louis Kahn's phrase, what does a school want to be? What is the desire of this? What wants to happen in this building? How does that will express itself into the building and then crystallize, manifest itself in the architecture? And that will is a will to power, to project its nature. It says the skyscraper wants to be a tall and soaring and proud thing. And then that's crystallized into form. So we're gonna spend quite a bit of time on this, because this is both Louis Kahn and Frank Lloyd Wright's approach to architecture. So, any questions about the Chicago school? No? So Frank Lloyd Wright goes to Chicago as a young man, works for a couple of architects, one named Silsby, then gets a job with Sullivan, which is it's like getting a job with Calatrava or Frank Gehry, you know, is the hot architect that if you were anti-establishment, revolutionary, envisioning a new architect, he's the one you wanted to be with, becomes his right-hand man. He refers to Sullivan as his Liebermeister, dear master, in German. Wright's got, I don't know how many at the time, but eventually 6 kids. He lives very expensively, expensive horses and later expensive cars, expensive clothes. He's always in debt. He's always in trouble financially. At one point later in his life, he incorporated himself and sold stock. And he started getting commissions to do suburban houses in his neighborhood, and which he did at night for extra money. You're not supposed to do that. You get work, you bring it into the office. The work belongs to the office, not to you. And so Sullivan got upset and fired him, and they didn't speak for a few decades, and finally they had a reconciliation. I'll tell you a little story about that, and then we'll go. Has anybody seen the movie The Fountainhead? Okay, it's definitely a fun movie. It's from a novel by Ayn Rand, who also did Atlas Shrugged. And it expresses her philosophy of the creativity of the individual. And so it's her defiant architect against the world. And he actually does a big project, and the developer sticks columns on it. So he dynamites it. So opening scene, there's an ambulance, and he gets in, and there's a dying guy. Howard Rourke, in the novel, in the movie, is based on Frank Lloyd Wright, loosely. The dying guy is Louis Sullivan. And Sullivan hands Wright, or hands Howard Rourke, this roll of drawings, his work. And he says, "You will burn these, won't you?" In other words, the world doesn't appreciate us. They don't deserve our stuff. It actually happened, except Sullivan handed Wright his roll of drawings and said, "You will publish these, won't you?" And Wright says, "Oh, shit. Why do I want to publish his stuff? I want to publish my stuff." But eventually he did, so. So these are real characters, and we're going to have fun going through them. So any questions about this sort of background to Frank Lloyd Wright? Okay, see you next week.